The stone walls of Castel Noir had stood for 3 centuries, weathering wars and storms, and the slow erosion of time itself. But in the autumn of 1348, they faced an enemy that cared nothing for fortifications, for strategic positions, for the courage of men. The plague had come, arriving like a dark tide that swept across Europe, leaving behind only silence and the sweet, sickly smell of death. Sir Aldric de Montfort had fought in 12 battles across France and the Holy Land. He had faced Saracen blades and English longbows. He had seen men die in every way war could devise. But nothing in his training, nothing in all his years of service to the Duke of Aquitaine had prepared him for this. The siege had lasted 4 months. The army outside the walls wasn't particularly large, perhaps 800 men under the banner of the rival Duke of Burgundy. Under normal circumstances, Castel Noir could have held for a year or more. The walls were thick, the wells deep, the granaries full. But these were not normal circumstances. The plague had entered the castle 3 weeks after the siege began. Perhaps it came with a merchant who had slipped through the lines, or perhaps it simply drifted on the wind like the breath of God's judgment. It didn't matter how it arrived. What mattered was that it spread through the close quarters of the castle like fire through dry timber. First, the servants fell. Then the soldiers. Then the knights themselves, these proud men who had thought themselves untouchable, brought low by something they couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't defeat with sword or lance or faith. Aldric watched his brothers-in-arms die, their bodies covered in the black buboes that gave the pestilence its name. He watched them burn with fever, heard them cry out for mothers dead 20 years, saw the light leave their eyes, and he waited for his own time to come. But it didn't. Day after day, as men fell around him, Aldric remained untouched. Some said it was God's favor. Others whispered that perhaps he had made a darker bargain. Aldric himself didn't know. He only knew that he was alive while better men died, and that survival had begun to feel more like a curse than a blessing. By the time winter approached, only 17 souls remained alive within Castel Noir. 13 were sick and dying. 3 were soldiers too weak from hunger to lift a sword. And then there was Aldric, the last knight standing in a castle of ghosts. And there was Marguerite. She had been a servant in the castle kitchens, a woman of perhaps 30 years with dark hair and darker eyes that had seen too much. Her husband and 2 children had been among the first to die. Aldric had watched her bury them in the castle courtyard, her face carved from stone, refusing to weep where others could see. While knights and lords cowered in their chambers, burning herbs and praying to saints, Marguerite moved through the castle like a spirit. She tended the sick with cloth soaked in vinegar tied across her face. She burned the bedding of the dead. She maintained the routines of life even as death claimed everything around her. Aldric found himself watching her, this servant woman who refused to surrender even when surrender was the only rational choice. There was something in her that he recognized, something that went beyond courage or duty. It was stubbornness elevated to a kind of grace. It was the human refusal to accept the unacceptable. One night, as Aldric stood watch on the eastern wall, Marguerite climbed the stairs to join him. The stars were brilliant overhead, indifferent to the suffering below. The besieging army's campfires glowed in the distance like a constellation brought to earth. "They're dying too," Marguerite said, nodding toward the enemy camp. "I can see it in how their numbers dwindle. The plague makes no distinction between friend and foe." Aldric nodded. He had noticed the same thing. The siege had become almost perfunctory. There were no more assaults, no more attempts to breach the walls. Both armies were simply waiting now, waiting to see which would be completely destroyed first. "Why do you stay?" Aldric asked. "The postern gate on the north wall, the one that leads to the river path. You could slip out in the night, make your way to another city, another life. Why remain here with the dead and dying?" Marguerite was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Where would I go? Every city, every village has the same story. At least here I know the shape of my prison. At least here, there is work to be done. Digging graves is not the work you were meant for. None of us are doing the work we were meant for, my lord. You were meant to win battles and earn glory. I was meant to raise children and grow old watching grandchildren play. But the world has other plans, and we must adapt or die." She turned to look at him then, and in the starlight he saw something in her eyes that stopped his breath. Not fear, not despair, but a kind of fierce determination that went beyond mere survival. "I have an idea," she said. "A mad idea, perhaps, But mad times call for mad actions. Over the next hour, as the castle slept and the stars wheeled overhead, Marguerite laid out her plan. It was audacious, it was probably suicidal. It was also the first thing in months that had given Aldric any sense of hope. The besieging army had grown careless. Why wouldn't they? The castle was clearly dying. Soon enough, they would be able to simply walk through the gates and claim victory over corpses. Their discipline had slackened. Their vigilance had waned. They were tired, sick, and increasingly convinced that this siege was more trouble than it was worth. Marguerite's plan was simple in concept, horrifying in execution. They would use the plague itself as a weapon. The castle's dead had been buried in the courtyard, but there were still bodies in the lower chambers, corpses too infected or too far gone to risk moving. They would load these bodies onto a cart, along with bedding and clothing soaked in the bodily fluids of the sick. Then, in the darkest hours before dawn, they would open the main gates and send the cart rolling toward the enemy camp, pushed by one of the dying soldiers who had volunteered for this final service. It would look like a desperate attempt to clear the castle of contamination, which it was, but it would also carry the plague directly into the heart of the enemy's position. And in the chaos that followed, in the panic and confusion as soldiers scattered from the death cart, two figures would slip through the postern gate and make their way down the river path to freedom. Two figures, a knight and a servant, equals in desperation, in determination, in the stubborn refusal to die quietly. "They'll hunt us," Aldric said. "If we're seen, if we're caught, they'll make examples of us." "Yes," Marguerite agreed, "but they have to catch us first, and they have to survive the plague long enough to try, and they have to care more about two refugees than about their own survival." She smiled then, a grim expression that held no joy but considerable satisfaction. "I've been preparing for 3 days. I have food, water skins, weapons taken from the dead. I know every path within 20 leagues of this place. My father was a hunter before the Lord's men hanged him for poaching. He taught me things. Why tell me this? Why not simply go yourself? Because you're the last knight in this castle, Sir Aldric. Because you've stood watch when you could have fled. Because you've treated the sick as if they were still human beings worthy of dignity. Because in this place of death, you've remained alive in ways that matter." She paused. "And because I cannot move the gate bar alone, I need someone strong enough to help me, and trustworthy enough not to betray me." Aldric looked out over the wall, over the dying castle and the dying army and the dark land beyond where the plague was remaking the world into something new and terrible. He thought of his oaths, his duty to hold this castle for his lord. But his lord was dead, had died screaming 2 weeks ago. His body burned with all the others. The castle would fall whether Aldric stayed or fled. The only question was whether he would die here or take his chances in the world beyond. "When?" he asked. "2 nights from now. When the moon is dark and the enemy's watch is weakest. Be ready." The next 2 days passed with agonizing slowness. Aldric maintained his routines, checking the walls, monitoring the enemy, tending to the few remaining living souls in the castle. But his mind was elsewhere, running through the plan again and again, identifying risks, calculating chances, preparing for the moment when he would leave this place that had been his home and his prison. Marguerite moved through the castle with her usual quiet efficiency, but Aldric noticed the subtle changes, supplies disappearing from the stores, weapons cleaned and sharpened. The way she studied the enemy camp with new intensity, memorizing patterns of movement, identifying the gaps in their vigilance. On the evening before their escape, Brother Thomas, the castle's last surviving priest, died peacefully in his sleep. It felt like an omen, though Aldric couldn't say whether it was good or ill. They buried him at sunset, Aldric and Marguerite and one of the dying soldiers who could still walk. There were no prayers. Brother Thomas had stopped believing in a God who would allow such suffering weeks ago, had admitted as much to Aldric before the fever took his mind. "Tomorrow," Marguerite whispered as they stood by the fresh grave. "Be at the main gate at the darkest hour. Wear dark clothing, nothing that reflects light. Bring only what you can carry, silently." That night Aldric couldn't sleep. He lay in his chamber listening to the sounds of the dying castle around him, moans of pain from the sick ward. The crackle of fires kept burning to ward off the miasma, the whisper of wind through the empty corridors, where once servants and soldiers had bustled with life and purpose. He thought about the life he was leaving behind, The oaths he had sworn, the brothers in arms who had died believing he would hold this place to the last. Was he betraying them? Or was he honoring them by refusing to die uselessly, by choosing survival over meaningless sacrifice? There were no easy answers. There never were. Not in war, not in plague, not in the hard choices that defined what it meant to be human. When the time came, Aldric was ready. He met Marguerite at the main gate as planned. She had 2 packs prepared, filled with supplies scavenged from throughout the castle. She had also brought 3 of the dying soldiers, men who had volunteered for this final mission. They understood they were sacrificing themselves, but they did so gladly, knowing their deaths would at least serve some purpose. The death cart was ready, loaded with its horrible cargo. The smell was overwhelming even through the cloth they wrapped around their faces. One of the soldiers, a man named Pierre who had been a farmer before the war, climbed onto the cart. He was so wasted by disease that he barely seemed human anymore, more skeleton than man. "For my family," Pierre whispered. "For my village. For every soul this cursed plague has taken." He smiled, revealing blackened gums. "And for the look on those bastards' faces when they see what's coming." Aldric and Marguerite worked together to lift the gate bar, a massive piece of oak that normally took 4 men to move. Desperation gave them strength. The bar shifted, groaned, finally came free. Slowly, trying to make no sound, they began to open the gates. The hinges creaked despite all the oil they had applied. The quiet of the night, it sounded like the screaming of demons. Aldric froze, certain they had been discovered. But no alarm sounded from the enemy camp. The besiegers slept on, dreaming of home or glory, or whatever men dreamed of when they were slowly dying of plague. The gates opened wide enough for the cart. Pierre, using the last of his strength, released the brake. The cart began to roll down the gentle slope that led from the castle gates toward the enemy camp, picking up speed as it went. Pierre's laughter echoed back to them, a sound of madness and triumph mingled together. "Now!" Marguerite hissed, and they ran. They went not through the main gates but through a narrow passage that led to the postern gate on the north wall. Behind them, they heard the first shouts of alarm as the death cart crashed into the enemy camp. Men screaming, the sound of panic spreading like the plague itself. The postern gate was smaller, easier to open quietly. Marguerite had oiled these hinges herself, tested them a dozen times. They swung open with barely a whisper. Beyond was darkness, and the narrow path that led down to the river. They plunged into the night, leaving behind the only world they had known. The journey that followed was one of hardship and constant danger. They traveled by night, hid during the day. They ate berries and roots and once a rabbit that Marguerite caught with snares her father had taught her to make. They drank from streams and prayed the water wasn't tainted. Behind them, they later learned, both the castle and the besieging army had been consumed by the plague. Castel Noir stood empty, a monument to the futility of war in the face of nature's indiscriminate wrath. The Duke of Burgundy's army scattered, carrying the plague with them, spreading it further across the already devastated land. But Aldric and Marguerite survived. They made their way to a small village in the mountains, far from the trade routes where the plague traveled. The village was wary of strangers, but Aldric's skill with sword and Marguerite's knowledge of healing herbs eventually won them acceptance. They never spoke of being a knight and a servant. Those roles belonged to the old world, the world before the plague. In this new world, they were simply 2 people who had survived when so many had died. 2 people who had chosen each other not out of love or duty, but out of the simple, profound need to not face the darkness alone. Years later, when the plague had finally burned itself out and Europe began the slow work of rebuilding, Aldric would sometimes wake in the night, his heart racing, remembering the smell of the death cart, the sound of Pierre's mad laughter, the moment when they stepped through the postern gate into uncertainty. And always, Marguerite was beside him, this woman who had faced down the apocalypse with nothing but stubbornness and will. She would take his hand in the darkness, and together they would wait for dawn. 2 survivors in a world that had learned how fragile civilization truly was. The castle's last breath had been one of defiance, not surrender. And in that defiance, in that refusal to die quietly, 2 lives had been saved. Not because they were noble or important or destined for greatness, but simply because they refused to accept that survival was impossible. Sometimes that refusal is enough.